and welcome to Coffee with a Consulting Forester. We've had a lot of fun with this program through this whole COVID-19, I don't even know what to call it, pandemic. Maybe that's what I should call it. Anyway, we're really happy to have Alan Calfee of Calfee Woodland Management on the call with us today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Alan in just a minute, and he'll give us a little background on himself and then what a consulting forester does, and then we'll take your questions in the chat box. So I ask that you all mute yourselves so that we don't have the background noise, and that we then listen to Alan, and then if you have any questions, please just type them in the chat box and I'll relay them to Alan, and we'll see how he fields the answers. So Alan, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. And I really want to thank Lisa and Kathleen for putting these together. I think they've been wonderful. I've participated in a couple of them, and it's been a real bright spot, I think, in the whole pandemic, and great to have people be able to get information about things and relate to each other and learn a little bit more about their roots. So thank you for that. Coverts is an organization that's very near and dear to me. It's been, I would say, very formative throughout my career. When I was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed graduate student at the University of Vermont and was wandering around the halls, introducing myself and talking to people, I wandered into Tom McAvoy's office. This was 1988, I believe. And he proceeded to tell me about a new project he was working on that was trying to get at what has been an age-old problem in forestry, which is how to reach the many people, it's close to 70,000 people in Vermont that own the majority of Vermont's woodlands. And the Forest Service and universities and the states had always had a hard time reaching these people with good information. And Tom and his colleague Steve Broderick, who was at the University of Connecticut, came up with this phenomenal idea on targeting leaders and people who have an interest in conservation, putting them through a training, and focusing on wildlife management as the primary focus. And he asked me that day or several days later if I'd be interested in working with him as a project forester. And I said I'd love to. I had an interest at that time in working with private landowners. I was getting my master's degree in forestry in silviculture, which silviculture you all may know, but it's basically how we tend the stand of trees for certain objectives. You can think of silvics relating to trees and their various phenology and qualities like that, and culture. So it's like gardening the forest. And I've helped him put out the nomination letters and review. At that time, we reviewed applications and ranked people. And I actually co-taught the workshops with him. And it was a very pivotal experience for me as a young forester, because I got to meet, and I say to this day that the Coverts Cooperator are like the top most, best people, most interested in stewardship, very dedicated to their land, thirsty for knowledge, wanting to learn everything and do the right things. And in those days, there were just some amazing people that I got to know and meet. David Clarkson and Jim Engel, who was president for a long time, and Doug Murray and Noel Fritzinger. And, these were people who became very active in Vermont's conservation and forestry. So throughout my career, when I've gotten down in the dumps about the state of the forest and the state of the world and humanity and all that, I've always been able to go back to Coverts and hang with the cooperators in person or in Zoom, and really be re-inspired by some of the people that have been through the program. So I got my master's in forestry. I started a private consulting business, and that was 30 years ago. And it's been quite a ride. I had a brief stint working for the National Wildlife Federation when the Forest Stewardship Council FSC certification first got started. And I set up that program in New England and actually worked on certifications around the world, including quite a bit in Russia, which was really fascinating to see a completely different part of the world. Yeah, so it's been wonderful. My business, there's two of us, myself and Mike White, who works with me. We're both licensed professional foresters. I've always supported the concept of licensing because I think it's important for people to know when they hire a forester what they're getting. These are very important assets for a lot of people, and key decisions need to be made that have very, very long-term impacts, obviously. What I like to say is we're here to help owners navigate their way through what it means to own and manage forest land. So a lot of that is actually helping them kind of clarify their objectives, what it is they're interested in doing, and then helping them go through the various processes. A lot of our work relates around the current use program or use value appraisal, because that's something a lot of people are interested in. We also do a lot of work around timber sales, marking trees for timber sales, preparing contracts, negotiating with loggers, and then overseeing the timber sales themselves. We have about 220 clients that own somewhere around 25,000 acres of land collectively. We work for private individuals. We work for some institutional owners. We have a few industrial clients, municipalities, nonprofits. Basically, our client base is as diverse as the people that actually own Vermont's forests. And I just put together a little list. I won't read the whole thing, but some of the things we're working on right now, obviously we just got through use value appraisal updates for owners, and extensions around the whole COVID thing. We're working on 2 timber trespass cases. Unfortunately, somehow we've become known to be expert in this and do a fair amount of it. I'd say it's my least favorite type of work, but we're happy to help people who have been wronged by thievery, basically. We're doing some recreational trail mapping for a local municipality. We're working on marking 2 timber sales right at the moment. We don't have any active sales right now. Maybe we'll get into this later, but the market's kind of upside down just as everything else is. We got our 2021 UVA applications for new enrollments. We're marking a 3-acre wildlife opening for a client in New York. A couple new tree farm enrollments. I'm a qualified tree farm inspector, so we do some of that. We do the NRCS CAP plans. You can get cost sharing from the NRCS to do management plans. We're doing some of that. Fielding calls, and I put fighting fires, and actually literally we had on one of our industrial owners had a wildfire on their land this spring, and so we're helping them assess that damage, and doing some timber appraisal work. We also find ourselves working a lot helping landowners navigate their way through working with Vermont Land Trust or other qualified organizations that hold easements, and we help them through various parts of that process. So that's a little bit of what we do and who I am, and I'm mostly here to answer your questions and talk to you guys. So take a sip of coffee and see if there are any questions that have come up.
That sounds great, Alan. I love working on the journey with the landowner, and particularly new landowners are like, who do I turn to? And I'm like, well, definitely call your county forester, talk to them, have them come walk your land. But, the person that you really need to figure out is who you want to work with as a consulting forester. And so it's great to have you on board today. So I want to ask you a question before we start, because I've been asking this of all my interviewees. Do you have, and if you do, what is your favorite tree and why?
Yes, I do. My favorite tree is the red oak, Quercus rubra. And my love affair with red oak began in college when I was working on my master's thesis. I was looking at the silviculture of red oak, and particularly the impact of deer browse on red oak regeneration. And I love it because it's one of our longer lived hardwood trees in Vermont. They've recorded trees over 400 years of age, actually red oak trees not far from here. They are not every year, but every 3 to 5 years, they produce a prolific seed crop, which many, many different animals are in some ways dependent on. Black bears, white-tailed deer, squirrels, chipmunks, turkeys. I mean, it's this whole host of animals that rely on that really high in fat and a little bit of protein food source from the acorns. And maybe more than anything, it's a little bit of a mystery. It's it's a tree that ended up in Vermont or parts of Vermont during a period where actually our climate was a little warmer, called the hypertismal. And it sort of in many ways doesn't belong here in this cold climate, but it seems to compete well on very dry sites, shallow to bedrock, ledgy sites. But it's really, really hard to regenerate. And I won't go into too much of that. It's some of the similar problems we have with other species, deer browsing and that kind of thing. But it's a real challenge to regenerate and grow red oak. So if you have red oak, be very careful with it. And, be sure not to cut it all before you get some regeneration going. It's just a beautiful tree and structure. When they're open grown, they have really, really beautiful growth form. They hold their leaves longer in the fall. It's just really a beautiful tree, and kind of a mystery.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm just a couple notes. Jock says he likes to think of silviculture as the management of sunlight.
Definitely important part of it.
Yep. And Tim notes that Mike just finished his UVA plan, and he says it's an extraordinary piece of work, and he says thank you to both you and Mike.
Yeah.
And then Margie would like to know, and this is a great question, should their forester stay in touch with them, or should they be proactive about staying in touch with their foresters? So how often do you have communication with your clients, or should you?
Yeah, Margie, that is a really good question. I would say in our business, we make an attempt to kind of keep a continuous conversation going through website and emails and such. But personally, I believe I don't kind of want to bother people or flood their inbox or other things with messages. So I think if there's something you need, it's a really good idea to reach out and connect with your consultant forester. If you're having a hard time doing that, if you're not getting calls back or emails back or whatever, that would concern me. But I think a lot of consulting foresters are individuals with really no backup, and they're managing their field work and all that. At the same time, they're trying to tend to calls and things. So it's helpful sometimes to reach out if there's something you need.
That sounds great. Yeah, it's a developing relationship over time. I mean, these forests. I always loved Tom McAvoy's from his book, The Forest Clock and the Human Clock. How the forest clock is so much longer than our human clocks, and so this relationship that we get into with our forester is really this long-term relationship. It's not a one and done with the plan. It's implementation of the plan and questions on tree health and all those kinds of things. So it's definitely a relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And you should feel that you share your sort of ethics and principles with your forester. That's a very important part of the relationship. One thing I want to say about myself is I'm also a landowner, and a lot of foresters aren't necessarily landowners. So I like to think that I empathize a lot with owners about concerns they have about, forest management and logging. The best logging in the world is still a big, messy process with big equipment and big changes in your woods and that type of thing. And I understand that, but there are two things probably that are so hard for us to grasp when we think about forests, and one is the time frame. I mean, these forests have really established themselves over thousands of years, and a generation of a tree like a sugar maple tree is 110 years, and we have a hard time even fathoming, right? Like 5 years, what's going to happen in 5 years, but especially today. And the second thing is space or scale. If you really want to appreciate forests, and now we have, Google Maps and GIS and things that help a little bit with this, but get up in an airplane and fly over the forest and understand, the scale of what we're talking about. And each of us has a little piece of that, which we're responsible for taking care of.
Yeah, I always tell all landowners, I always ask at the training, how many of you have, Google Earthed and looked at your property? And the numbers have increased as more and more people are familiar and comfortable in using Google Earth, which is awesome.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat box from Liz Thompson. Liz wants to know how much you see people taking advantage of the ESTA program.
Hi, Liz. That's a great question. Not a lot, I have to say. We have done, probably like a dozen plans since the ESTAs were first created. And sorry, and Lisa, you have to give me the button. Foresters love acronyms. So ESTAs are ecologically sensitive treatment areas. And it's a piece of the use value program that I was very happy to see come around. And I'm sure Liz had a lot to do with it behind the scenes. Thank you for that. And what it allows, fundamentally, when you enroll your land in the current use program, you really have to actively manage any of the productive forest land that you enroll. You are allowed 20% non-productive. We won't get into the weeds on the nitty gritty, but so basically before there were ESTAs, if you had some type of ecologically unique area like a wooded wetland or important riparian areas or older forests, old growth forests, things like that, you had to exclude them. You really couldn't enroll them if you felt that the best management for those areas did not involve any silviculture or tree cutting. So it's really been a phenomenal thing, but I don't see a lot of people taking advantage of it. We certainly flag things when we're doing our original, inventory or assessment of our property if there's something that meets the criteria, but we don't see a lot of that happening, and I think there is some concern at higher levels that ESTAs aren't being taken advantage of.
Did you have any clients that use the old growth forest category? And if so or not, do you see any challenges in using that provision?
Well, I'm quite proud to say that part of my land in North Pollitt, actually, which I no longer own, but it was the first old forest ESTA in the state of Vermont. I had a wonderful day out in the field with Mike Snyder, and I think this was when he was still a county forester. Mike Snyder and Eric Hansen looking at this particular forest, and I'll try to remember the criteria. I think there has to be at least 3 age classes of trees, which doesn't sound like something that's that unusual, but believe it or not, it really is something unusual in our forests, mostly because of the agricultural history. A lot of our trees kind of are even age forests. It has to contain old trees. I think trees over 100 years of age. And for some reason now I'm blanking a little bit on the third criteria, but that is the only old forest ESTA I haven't been involved in. But I'm on kind of a new mission because I believe very much that there's a lot of good science and certainly around the concerns about carbon now that show that older forests are really an important part of the landscape. And I think we need to use the current use program as a way to help landowners, if they have an interest in doing that, develop that. And the current standards, which are based mostly on, I mean, we have ability to work in other objectives like wildlife and aesthetics and things like that, but the fundamental standards around the statistics of your forest management are largely around, productive growth of timber products. So I think we need to do a better job giving people tools that they can let forests grow a little longer and develop some of those old forest characteristics.
Great. So you answered some of the questions that popped in there because Mark, you wanted to know, how do you know if you have an old growth forest? So you shared some of that with the criteria. And Tim wants to know, what are the prime old growth forests in Vermont? Are there some that we can go see, or is there any real good examples?
Tim, that is a really good question. Last I knew by, and Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was about 35 acres of known sort of real undisturbed old growth forests in Vermont, and that was in I think 7 different blocks or something like that. And the numbers may be wrong, but just the point is there's not a lot of it out there, mostly in places that people couldn't get to cut timber. Some of them, fortunately, were then protected under public ownership. I would all really recommend to you guys to, Liz wrote a phenomenal piece in the last Vermont Land Trust newsletter on old growth that combines a little bit of science and aesthetics and philosophy, and it's really well written because these are really special places. There's one, Gifford Woods State Park in Mendon.
Somewhere
over there. That's probably the easiest to access. I think it's, in my mind, it's slightly controversial. There's some debate as to whether there actually was some management that's occurred over time. Let's see. There's one in Groton State Forest. I think it's one of the bigger pieces. And Tim, if you want to reach out, I can maybe help direct you to those. Interestingly enough, there's a little tiny piece behind Burton Seminary in Manchester. And it's a really cool story because Charlie Codbill, who's a phenomenal forest ecologist from up north, was doing some research on a piece of conserved land there owned by the Equinox Hotel called the Equinox Preservation Trust. And Charlie goes back through the land records and does research on land ownership to try to understand forest use and how the forest there developed. And he discovered in a deed from like the 1850s, so right around the peak of agricultural clearing in Vermont, a reference to seminary woods. And it turns out what it was the woodlot when they built the seminary in Manchester that they used for fuel wood. But when he went and looked at this, now it's a couple of different people's sort of backyards and stuff. When he went and looked at it, it had old growth characteristics. There had been trees cut from there, but it had, you know, big old trees and lots of jumbles of windfalls. And we did a couple field trips out there, and that's kind of interesting. You can walk from the parking lot. I think they built a new parking lot, but if you walk the trail that goes from Burn Burton into Equinox Preservation Trust, you walk along it, it's off to your left, and you can kind of go out there and wander through it. But I had a thought that I was going to mention, and I lost it.
That's right. Liz popped something into the chat box that there may be a little more to answer the question on old growth patches in Vermont. So people can click on that link. Following up with old growth, though, Rich wants to know, what kind of things can landowners do to help promote old growth characteristics in their woods?
Well, is this Rich Chalmers?
It is.
Oh boy, he's not going to like my answer. Leave it alone. Just especially areas. Oh, I know what the thought, and it relates to your question, Rich. So I believe that, so old growth, like pristine old growth, are places that we believe there has not been any human interference, and that's very rare. But there are places, and we have some of this on our own property, that have never been converted to agriculture. So they've been continuously forested. They still have a soil structure that's like a forested soil structure. You know, it hasn't been disturbed by plowing or whatever. And so, Rich, one thing you could do is look at your property and see if you can determine, a good way to do this is to use, you can get the 1942 aerial photos. That was the first time they flew aerial photos of all of Vermont. Obviously, it was pre-war. They weren't interested in forestry, but you can look at those 1942 aerial photographs and look for places on your property that were forested at that time. And you will know then that those are older portions of forest on your property, and those would be the areas to focus on helping them develop old forest characteristics. But that it really would include not cutting in those areas would be the most extreme, and allowing, you know, if there's a big blowdown and a bunch of trees fall over, leaving them there. Very hard to do for the fastidious forester or woodland owner, because that is an important characteristic of old growth forest. There's a lot of down wood, big trees, and down debris on the ground. So letting those stay and helping it develop that character. One step back, so from not doing anything, and this might be the first key with working around the current use standards, would be extending your rotations. So instead of going in every 15 or 20 years to do harvesting, maybe double that. And I know we're getting into timeframes that are hard to consider, but that would be an important step too. Just let them develop that older character without, you know, fiddling with it. So that's what I would recommend. First, identify where you have the greatest potential for old forest by what's been forested for the longest, and then take a little more care in tending that. Maybe consider a old forest ESTA if it has the characteristics that meet the standards.
Jeff had an interesting take on what you were saying. He says, what if my property is heavily infested with invasive? I fear that if I left it alone, it would just become a buckthorn forest.
Well, Jeff, the thing I have actually noticed, and you know, it's a little funny because after 30 years of my career, I find that I'm finding more and more situations where it's better actually to leave it alone and let Mother Nature do what she does best. And I found a very good example of that on a piece of family property that had a white pine stand that had like an understory of buckthorn. And actually leaving it alone, like delaying an entry for a couple of cycles, what happened is the canopy kind of filled in the stand, cut the light out to the understory. The technical word we use for that in forestry is stem exclusion. You know, it's that point in stand development where the crowns are really tightly packed together and there's very little light getting to the understory. And actually the buckthorn then died out to a great degree, not 100%, but so keeping, you know, that's one case actually where I would argue again to extend the cutting cycle or rotation is if you have a heavy infestation of invasive plants, leave that canopy intact. You know, use the lack of light and available growing space as a way to combat the invasives. If that makes sense. Does that make sense, Jeff?
I'm going to stick on invasives for a second. So David asked earlier, he says there's a fair amount of invasive plants, mostly barberry. He says he kept a record of the number of plants that he's removed. Is it important for him to keep records for his current use plan of what he takes out? Is that an important piece?
Absolutely. One, it's very important to show that you're doing activity on your forest management plan to the county forester. Two, it'll help people in the future understand what you did, how it worked, and whether it's worth repeating and that kind of thing. Records on what you do in your woods are really, really helpful, you'll find, over the long term. You know, forestry, fortunately or unfortunately, is a long-term prospect, and lands change hands or new generations take over, and having an accurate record of what's happened in a forest really can help inform better management going forward. So absolutely.
Great. Jeff had a follow-up question on his buckthorn. Should he still be cutting the buckthorn and you know, doing something with it that way, or? So I am, and I sarcastically said invasives are my favorite subject. They kind of are, in a way. I mean, it's a very important piece of management. Things we do can certainly exacerbate the situation. I happen to be in the school of favoring the use of chemicals to control invasives because I think we should use whatever tools we can. I don't know how Jeff is doing it, but buckthorn is one that's very easy to control using what's called the cut stump treatment. You cut the stump off and then you apply just to the cambium layer, usually a formulation of like 40% glyphosate. And I am a certified pesticide applicator, so I can talk about using herbicides. Excellent.
And it's a very targeted way. Buckthorn responds very well. That's a positive way of saying you can kill it easily to that treatment. So I would encourage him, if he's into doing that any way you can reduce the seed producing capacity in your forest is going to help your forest and your neighbor's forest by keeping that seed bank down.
Excellent. Yeah, those invasives are something else.
So one thing I wanted to say, and when I started out, I actually got into this whole thing working on my mom's property, our beloved woodlot in Dorset, and back, cutting brush and opening up old fields and that type of thing. My first business was called Choice Cuts, and we did tree takedowns, and I cut a lot of honeysuckle. And when I went to graduate school, by no fault of my professors, but we never talked about invasive species. It was just not part of the conversation then. And it's been interesting to see it develop. And it's something that a lot of landowners, unfortunately, have to battle with. So it's something we end up spending quite a bit of time on. And I would encourage you, if you do have invasive problems, to reach out to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, because they have cost share programs that'll help you pay, because it can be expensive to control. So that's one source for getting a little help.
Jeff had a follow-up question since you mentioned honeysuckle. What's the best way to treat honeysuckle? Is that also stump treating?
So honeysuckle by its growth form just is more difficult because it layers, so it has this bushy growth form where the branches come down, so it's harder to get to the stump. I generally find a foliar treatment is better for honeysuckle. If you're not into using chemicals, honeysuckle is a really easy one to pull. I'm always out pulling little honeysuckle plants in my walks in the woods. So you can either pull them by hand. If they get bigger and you have a little tractor, you can put a chain around them and pull them out that way. But with chemical treatment, I've found that foliar treatment is basically more efficient with honeysuckle.
It's nice that there are alternatives for landowners and how they feel, and they can make those choices. I think that's really an important point.
Yeah, buckthorn. Like buckthorn and barberry are very difficult to pull, but especially when they get older. So that's why I wanted to point that out. That's one positive quality of honeysuckle.
It's good to find the positives. It's good to find the positives.
Always look for the positive.
That's right. I'm sure that there are some landowners out there that are asking you now, what kind of changes do I need to make to my plan or my management strategies in light of climate change? Is this something you're getting asked, and what might you say to a landowner?
Absolutely. It's something we're getting asked. I really think actually it's something we've always thought carefully about in our management plans. Not particularly maybe the threat of climate change, although I'm sad to say that when I studied natural resource management back in the 80s, that climate change was at that point very much on the horizon, and something that a lot of people predicted would happen if we didn't change our ways. But the reason I say we didn't dramatically change our plans, our planning process, or our strategies, I guess, is that good forestry, you really always want to be looking at how can you help develop a forest that is very resilient or most resilient to many possible threats: insects, disease, climate change. And that's really all about diversity. And trying to increase the diversity of age classes, like we've kind of pointed to a little bit. A healthier forest will have, a mature canopy, and then developing trees in the mid canopy, and then also strong regeneration underneath. So if something changes in the canopy, that forest can respond. You want to maintain the highest diversity of natural native tree species that you can through your management. So you don't want to ever really focus on removing or favoring any particular species, because as we have unfortunately seen with some of our pest problems already, and emerald ash borer in particular, if you lose an entire species in your forest, you want to have other species that are there growing that can respond and take over. So managing a forest to be healthy and resilient will help it in the light of many different threats. I guess the one thing we've changed slightly, thinking about climate change, is a bit more of a focus on some of our species that are better adapted for warmer climates. So like red oak, down here we have a couple different species of hickory and things like that. Just want to make sure we maintain those trees in our forests.
Great. Here's a great question from Alicia. She is a smaller landowner. They have less than 25 acres, so they're not eligible for UVA. What do you recommend for smaller landowners who want to manage their land? Should they still write a management plan? And are there foresters and loggers who will work with smaller landowners?
Absolutely. So, and a lot of our forests in Vermont, Alicia, is made up of owners just like yourself. And 25 acres is a nice little chunk of woods. I would say there's really no threshold for the size of a parcel that can and should be managed. That's my air quotes. You know, the tricky part comes in to say you do want to do some kind of a treatment. Obviously, it completely depends what you have growing out there. If you have 25 acres of sugar maple veneer, then you can make easy choices and cut trees that have high value and probably break even or maybe make a little money. If you have 25 acres of a forest that was recently high graded, which remind me, Lisa, I want to come back to high grading before the end of the call.
Okay.
And high graded means just that all the best trees were cut and all the junk was left. A very common practice, unfortunately. Not in managed forests, but in forests that don't have any good direction. Then it's going to be a challenge if you want to do some kind of a treatment to do it in a way that's going to be economically viable, meaning you may have to actually pay to have the work done, which certainly changes the formula. I'm not sure now. NRCS also has funding available for doing crop tree release and some improvement practices like that for non-commercially viable stands. I'm not sure what the acreage threshold is. I'm just looking at my wife who used to work for NRCS.
And they pay for management plans.
Is there an acreage threshold?
I don't remember, but
She doesn't remember. but I think, you know, again, 25 acres and management doesn't necessarily always mean cutting trees, as I kind of pointed to around the old growth. You know, certainly building trails or keeping areas that you like to go and enjoy. You can certainly, you know, like crop tree release is something you can do on your own, either with a chainsaw if you feel comfortable with that, or have done the game of logging with cupboards, or you can girdle trees. I have a little handheld girdling tool that's just a blade that you can run around the tree and double girdle it and kill off trees. It used to be my Zen meditation technique. After work, I'd go out and spend a couple hours girdling striped maple. So the answer is yes, and a lot of the hows and whys depends on what you actually have growing out there. So you can certainly call your county forester. He'll come out and look. He has no acreage threshold, and that might be a good place to start to get some advice on how to move forward.
Great. I'm going to jump back because you talked a little bit about NRCS. And first off, let me say hi, Jeannie, in the background. David wants to know, can you talk a little bit about the cost sharing program and what type of management activities are available?
Yes, I can. And I would just I guess by disclosure or something, say it's changes a lot. So I'm going to be a little broad. The best thing to do is to contact your local USDA NRCS office. You can find their contact information if you just Google USDA NRCS Vermont. But they have a program called EQUIP. Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which includes a variety of different practices that they cost share. And I think often they encourage you as the first step actually to do a management plan. It's called a CAP plan. Don't ask me what CAP stands for, but CAP management plan, and they do cost sharing on that. And so, and then they do practices that include invasive plant control and actually invasive initial treatment, and then you can do a follow-up treatment a few years later, which is a really good idea. They have wildlife practices that include patch cuts, doing patch cuts, and these are generally in areas that are non-commercial, meaning they don't have the commercial timber potential that would support you being able to do that as a part of a regular harvest. Let's see, they used to do apple tree release. I'm not sure if they do that anymore. Apple tree pruning, crop tree release. So crop tree release, you pick a crop tree and then you go in and you thin it on 3 sides, at least 10 feet clear from the crown. They have some trail stabilization programs where you can install or fix water bars on trails where there's erosion, that type of thing.
Delayed mowing.
Delayed mowing. So if you have agricultural hay field that has grassland birds like bobolinks, they will actually cost share to skip the first cut of mowing, maybe even the second cut. I think it's through August 1st or something like that. But I would advise you to contact them. Last I saw, their website was terrible, but if you call one of the soil conservationists, they're really fantastic people. I married one. And they'll come out and walk it with you and help you all the way through the process.
And I can help find the contact too.
Yeah, generally, like for us, we work as a team, as a consulting forester with a landowner and the NRCS people, and helping people get what they want done. Excellent.
Excellent. All right. I have 2 more questions in the chat box I think we have time to get to. So the first is, Liz owns less than 2 acres of woods and it's heavy to ash. Should I do anything or just wait? So really, we all, want to know what's going on with ash and what should we do with the ash in our woods?
I didn't think we were going to get through this without talking about ash. Well, hopefully some of you watched the commissioner last week, and because I always quote the commissioner when it comes to emerald ash borer and white ash, and that is, don't be rash with your ash. It's very important, and there are actually some unscrupulous loggers out there that are taking advantage. White ash happens to be one of the bright spots in the timber markets right now because of a plant in Wallingford that makes tool handles for Ames True Temper. And so they're going around telling people that they should cut all their ash trees because they're all going to die. And then, of course, they come in and they only cut the good ones and they leave the crappy suppressed ones. That's back to my high grading theme, which we may not be able to get to in this call, but maybe we can have a coffee with high grading call. So I think the really important message about ash is not to freak out and think that you should go cut all your ash. We want to keep, and unfortunately, again, this is counter to the economics, because we want to keep our strongest, healthiest white ash trees out there. They're dioecious, meaning they're male and female trees. So we need to keep female trees that produce seeds, and we want to keep regeneration. Probably regeneration right now is one of the most important things, because they are showing that there is some genetic resistance to the emerald ash borer, and that younger trees can do better. So if I had 2 acres of white ash, pretty pure white ash stand, I would go out and look and see what it looks like on the forest floor. Do you have any young white ash trees? And if not, it might be that you want to consider, and ash makes wonderful firewood, but you might want to consider taking some trees out to create some gaps in the canopy and see if you can get some regeneration going. It can seed quite prolifically, and if you put light on the forest floor and you've got a decent site, meaning relatively good growing conditions soil-wise, it's not a hard species to regenerate. So that would be, you want to be looking at the future forests of your ash, but I would not recommend going out and cutting all of it at all.
Great, thanks for that. We're going to take you back to high grading.
Yeah.
Margie noted that you mentioned high grading, and you said good trees are cut leaving just junk. And she said you mentioned red oak and hickory as good trees. Can you name others and give examples of junk?
Okay, so high grading is a term everyone should know and be aware of. Unfortunately, a lot of the logging work that's happening in Vermont is not supervised by a forester, and is just being conducted by someone in the cab of a machine, mostly now, or with a chainsaw. And really, no fault on them. In some cases, they're doing it knowingly, but they tend to pick the trees that have the greatest value and leave the junk trees. And it cuts the heart out of the forest, really. Good forestry, we want to be doing exactly the opposite, actually. We want to be keeping our best trees and cutting as much junk as we can economically, and letting those trees develop in form and value. They contribute to some of those characteristics we were talking about with old forests, and et cetera. And I guess high grading is particularly insidious to me because, everybody was out clear cutting, it would be really visible and people would be shocked. And I'm not, clear cutting is a valid silvicultural treatment, but the problem with high grading is it goes on, the mountainside is still green, but like I said, the heart has kind of been cut out of the forest. And it's part of my story of how I got into forestry, actually. Our beloved woodlot was high graded. It's too long a story at this point, but that was 1979, and that stand has not recovered to date. So it can take hundreds of years, really, for a stand to recover from high grading.
What is junk?
So junk trees, mostly when I'm saying junk, I'm not necessarily referring to species, although, I'm referring to form. So one of the terms the unscrupulous logger will use to help co-opt the landowner into going along with this is they'll say, well, we're going to cut only the big trees and let the little ones grow. Well, as I said before, most of our forests are actually even age. So the big trees are just the winners. They're the ones that are doing better. And the little trees are probably the same age, but aren't competing well, maybe less healthy for some reason. So you're removing the best trees and leaving the suppressed or struggling trees. So when I'm talking about junk, I'm mostly talking about form. So, a good straight bole that has high value for timber versus, jagged, crooked tree with lots of branches. Some trees are considered junk because there are no markets for them, like American beech. Unbelievably, still bitternut hickory has very few markets, although there's some growing. What else? Hop hornbeam. It's a great firewood, a very important wildlife tree, but has no commercial value. And unfortunately, we've lost a lot of wood producing industries like Rutland plywood and some of these others that used to use lower quality wood to make products and would pay for them. But when I say junk, I mean mostly smaller, poorly formed trees that aren't competing well.
That shows the importance of working with a forester instead of, so that they have a plan and a marked, because I always remember Tom used to say, you can't breed larceny out of someone's soul. So if they're like, oh, that's a really nice tree and I need to pay for my kids' braces, if it, you know, that's what's important about marking and executing a cut in a particular way. And can you explain, like, so you said in the beginning you're a licensed forester. What does that mean, and how does that continue? Like, there's continuing education. What is that? How does that work?
Yeah, and so quickly too, I feel it's very important that the person marking the stand have no economic interest in that output. That's why we charge by the hour. We do not charge a commission. Our interest is you're getting the greatest value out of over time and doing the right thing for the forest. Even when I go out and do crop tree release or whatever, I go out first with a paint gun and mark the trees. And then I can just go out with a chainsaw and cut the trees I'd marked. I'm not making the decision with a chainsaw in my hand, because you don't make very good decisions.
You can't put it back.
No. Remind me again your question that I overlooked.
About licensed foresters. What does that mean? And because that's new to Vermont.
That's new to Vermont now. Where are we? 3 years ago, I think, because I've renewed my license once. So a licensed professional forester has to meet certain educational requirements, meaning that you've been trained in the important sciences around forestry. You have to abide to a certain ethical code in your relationship with the landowner, and we're required to do ongoing continuing education to a certain point, so that we're on top of current issues and problems and stay fresh in our knowledge of forestry and sciences. And then also there's a pathway if someone violates any one of those, or obviously does a criminal activity on somebody's land, that there's a way that person can be removed from the profession. I mean, that sounds draconian, but basically that's before, all you needed was a pickup truck and a paint gun, and you could pull up to somebody's door and say you were a forester. And they just by you saying you were a forester implied some level of education or experience. That's the other component of licensing is some level of experience practicing forestry.
Great. All right. Well, we're approaching 10 o'clock. Do you have any final words you'd like to share?
Let's see. Well, I would say just get out in your woods, enjoy them. I think for me, the most I ever knew about forests and forestry was the day I graduated from forestry school, and have spent my entire career, looking and discovering and learning that there's a lot out there that I don't know about. It's a very complex ecosystem. I like to say forestry is not rocket science, it's more complicated. And so open up your eyes and look around at all the various pieces of it. And, be proud of your opportunity to be a steward of Vermont's really important forest resources, and going forward with all the changes that our world faces, forests are going to be a very crucial ecosystem to protect, and they're under great threats right now. So we need more landowners like you guys that are engaged and involved and wanting to do the right thing.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Alan. It's been a lot of fun. Vermont Coverts and VWA is so glad to bring these coffees to you. Our next one is next Friday, and we'll be featuring Kathy Decker, who is a forest protection specialist. So she deals with the disease and what's threatening our forests. So it should be very interesting. We also have on Tuesday night, Carolyn Loeb will be speaking about the Vermont conservation design. So if you've heard that and you're not quite sure what it is, please join us. It's a great way to look at how we're managing, conserving, and looking at Vermont's habitat and natural communities, and we'd love to have you join us for that. And if you haven't signed up for our e-newses, you can do it on either one or both of the websites. And please share these programs to your front porch forums or your town listservs, because we really want people to know about these kinds of things. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Again, thank you, Alan, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day and weekend, and see you next week.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Bye, everyone.